Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Teaching Writing in College. I'm your host, Dr. Tom Skeen, and our driving question is, how can instructors in higher education leverage theory, science, pedagogy, and craft most effectively to help their learners with writing? And the benefit is for students. One thing that I would like to emphasize in the podcast is that it's really all about the students. Over my career, especially when I started, even before I started teaching, and I thought, I want to be an English professor. I thought I'm going to learn a lot by being in the classroom, which has been true, and I've learned a lot. I really love learning. That's part of the reason why I'm doing the podcast now, is because I like to learn about my discipline. I like to learn about how to teach it. But really the benefit is for students, and that's something that I think is important as well, that the things that I do, the things that we do as instructors can benefit our students and enrich their lives. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to do what I do. And this episode is about how learning transfer works for me, anecdotes from 30 years ago. I've got some anecdotes from my time as an undergrad, which it's hard to believe for me, but it's been 30 years almost since I graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English. And I've got some memories that still stick with me today, and some knowledge that I still use, even though, I studied literature. There are some things that I still use as a writing instructor. And so I want to talk about those. They're from linguistics and grammar courses that I taught. But 30 years ago, I've got some knowledge that has stuck with me for that long. And so just a couple of anecdotes here from my days as an undergrad. And I want to, focus on conceptual knowledge, because that's what we've been talking about, the Elon Statement on writing transfer. One of the first enabling practices is conceptual knowledge. That's going to be knowledge about writing. And in my case, it's going to be knowledge about linguistics and grammar. But conceptual knowledge is really important. It's where transfer starts. So for this linguistics class, it was English 421. We had to take at least one of these two, linguistics and grammar, as part of our program, along with, several period courses in literature, like 3 of them, I think, in English literature, 2 of them in American literature, or maybe it was 4 and 3. I can't quite remember now. But we also had to take a linguistics and grammar course. We had to take a Shakespeare course, a Chaucer course, and an advanced writing course, I think, for English majors, and a few others, but linguistics and grammar. So I went into a linguistics course with the professor, and the course wasn't about writing. It was not about literature, which everybody was used to studying. And in this particular case, there was a reputation, I think, about this professor that it was going to be a hard course. And so I got ready, I went in, and one of the first things that he talked about or asked us to do was to create flashcards for ourselves and to memorize some of the terms that we would need to be able to do some linguistic analysis. And so these were terms like the anatomy of the mouth, like what a dental is, or what a labial is, or a glottal is, and so on, and voiced and voiceless. And then there were different kinds of sounds like fricatives and stops and glides and so on, nasals. And so he said, what, the easiest thing to do is to memorize those kinds of facts at the outset, and then you're going to be able to follow up with the ability to understand, what's going on over time. So I went ahead and I did that. And I really enjoyed the course. I was successful in it. And he, at the end of the semester, pulled me aside one day and said, hey, you know what? I'm going to teach this class again next. Well, it wasn't semesters. We were on quarters. I'm going to teach this class again next quarter. And I would like you to help me with it as a supplemental instructor. My university, Weber State University at the time, had a supplemental instruction program where professors could hire, students to be instructors and not instructors, but guides, tutors for the classes that they were teaching. And so the university would train me, and then he could use me in the linguistics course, and my duties were to sit in the course as it was being taught, with all the students, and to be a resource for them. I set up study sessions with them, throughout the quarter, and helped them along the way. And I really enjoyed it. It was great. I had a lot of fun doing that. When he pulled me aside, he said, "You know what? The course does seem like it's, difficult. And I think it would be really useful for students if they could have that kind of a resource. And I already asked somebody else, but she can't do it, so could you?" And I thought, that's great. I'm really happy to, even though I was kind of a second stringer, I guess. But it turned out really well. I really enjoyed it. Got a good grade in the course, and so on. But it all came down to memorizing that vocabulary at the beginning of the course. It was easy for me to kind of follow the lectures when he would be lecturing, or we'd be doing class activities and he would pose a question. Sometimes I could tell. There were a couple of times I remember giving an answer that was a couple of steps ahead of where he wanted to be with the class, but it really did all come down to that vocabulary. Grammar, English 320. I enjoyed linguistics so much that I decided to take grammar, so I took it also at the end of that year, in the spring quarter of that year. And one anecdote I have from that, the same kind of concepts, the factual knowledge, the basis was really important. It made it easier to understand everything else that came after that. But I sat down in the testing center to take a test for this grammar course. And I was in there taking the test, and I recognized a fellow student from my class walk in, and he sat down with his test maybe a couple of rows to the side of me, and it was a little bit quiet over there. I didn't hear the pencil marking, sometimes that you hear in a testing situation. And after a little bit of time passed, he got up and took his test back to the proctor, and the room was small enough I could hear what he said. He said, "You know what? Hey, I just was not expecting this. This is too hard. I can't do it. I have to forfeit the test." And so he gave his test back and he left. But I suspect that what happened was he just did not have access to the knowledge because of the vocabulary. It takes some effort and some real work. And I don't think I realized this as much as an undergrad as maybe I should have, but understanding that factual knowledge and the conceptual knowledge that goes along with it is really a key to understanding a lot of bodies, different kinds of knowledge. And just by contrast, I also remember this happening in a couple of other classes. So a theater and stagecraft class when I was a sophomore, a botany class when I was a freshman. I remember struggling a little bit in those classes and not knowing exactly what was going on. And I do remember specifically in the theater class that the professor there said, "You know what, you ought to memorize some of the key facts, the key bits of knowledge here, because it's going to help you along the way." I remember that for sure. But botany, I remember the same kind of thing. That was a science elective that I could take, and I remember going to the large lectures and then sitting in on the labs, and I remember just not knowing some of the different kinds of plants or some of the parts of the plants that we would be studying, and that too is vocabulary. I could have really benefited just from studying the vocabulary behind those. So anyway, that's the importance of conceptual knowledge. I've got some knowledge that still sticks with me from linguistics that we'll see here in a little bit. I still use that knowledge today as a writing instructor. But the Elon Statement on writing transfer, just for a quick review. Constructing writing curricula, this is the first enabling practice. Constructing writing curricula and classes that focus on study of and practice with concepts that enable students to analyze expectations for writing and learning within specific contexts. These include rhetorically based concepts such as genre, purpose, and audience. And so having a strong understanding of some basic factual knowledge is one thing that the Elon Statement is after. Writing is about genres, it's about purpose, it's about audience, and so on. And just having a good understanding of those can really be helpful for students and for instructors. My definition of conceptual knowledge is just that it's an abstract understanding of something, and it's based on a body of factual knowledge and connections within that body of knowledge. And we'll kind of see that as time goes on. But we kind of have a model, and it comes very much from the concepts that we learn about a given topic. And that just reminds me about Doug Downs and Elizabeth Wardle's assertion that we can't teach students to write, but we can teach students about writing. And that's really what conceptual knowledge is all about. It's about understanding the way something works. It's understanding about something. And that's really what we're after here. That's really what enables us with any kind of knowledge that we want to acquire. And writing is a discipline. It's not just a skill. It's a discipline. It's got a language. It's got some knowledge behind it. And so that's really important too. In the book, Why Don't Students Like School? A really important book that I really have enjoyed, and it's really helped me in my teaching, and I'd recommend it to anybody. But Daniel T. Willingham says, research from cognitive science has shown that the sorts of skills that teachers want for students, such as the ability to analyze and to think critically, require extensive factual knowledge. And factual knowledge must precede skill. So that's an important concept in his book. Factual knowledge must precede skill. And so it's really important for students to learn about writing so that they can then use that knowledge to make decisions about writing. Really, that's what we want. If we want, critical thinking in our writing courses, part of the critical thinking is, making critical decisions about writing and how one approaches writing in a given context. And so that factual knowledge background, that conceptual knowledge background for students will enable them to make choices and to make reasoned judgments about what they're doing in their writing. And just one other quick example, I see factual knowledge and conceptual knowledge all the time, just everywhere around me, and for other disciplines or bodies of knowledge. And here, just in the news on NPR, within the last couple of weeks, I saw this one. I didn't get the title of the article, but it's about, I think the title is Want to Understand Your Teenager's Brain, or Your Teenager, or something like that. Understand Their Brain is, I think, the title of it. Want to Understand Your Teenager, Understand Their Brain, or something like that. But you can see the date there. It was May 23rd, 2023, if you want to look it up. But when I look at the news, very often I see this, I see factual knowledge or conceptual knowledge just being explained briefly so that the readers can follow along as the journalist provides information. And so here we have a process known as synaptic pruning, which I never knew would have existed. So what synaptic pruning is, the brain accumulates a lot of different synaptic connections in the early years of life. And then when someone gets to be an adolescent, the brain starts making decisions about what kinds of knowledge to keep and emphasize. What does the brain think is going to benefit the person, and what can be left out. And so synaptic pruning is about letting some knowledge go while retaining other knowledge. That's something that the brain does in adolescence. Then there's another one, myelinated, just means that synapses those connections are insulated with fatty tissue, which not only speeds neuronal transmission but protects from any further changes. And so there you go again, another bit of language there, just to kind of help somebody understand what's going on. That kind of language, that specific language that specialized language is critical for understanding, even for lay people like me. So for transfer, I'm using linguistics as a writing teacher. So the classes I was talking about before, my anecdotes from before when I was in college are, those happened about 30 years ago or so. But my knowledge has influenced my perception of students' writing. The issue of correctness always comes up in my classes and in everybody's classes. And when I'm, talking to other teachers or when we're sitting in workshops and stuff, the issue of correctness almost always comes up. But one bit of theoretical knowledge, we'll get to that in a minute too, but conceptual knowledge, I'll say for now, correctness is based on a speaker's perception. That's an idea that I encountered both in the linguistics course and the grammar course. Language is naturally variant, and correctness is based on a speaker's perception. That's been really influential for me as a writing teacher as I've thought about how to help my students. So just to go back to linguistics for a moment, some of the knowledge that I remember, and grammar, voiced bilabial fricatives in Spanish and English. So a bilabial fricative is almost like an F or a V, excuse me, but instead of being the lips and the teeth together, it's the two lips together. So that's a voiceless labiodental fricative, the letter F is, but a voiceless bilabial fricative would be, it's the same kind of sound, except it's pushed through the two lips together instead of the lips and the teeth. And voiced is a B, a V instead of an F. A voiced labiodental fricative is the letter V, but then a voiced bilabial fricative is the two lips together in Spanish. But as it turns out, one dialect of English at least, which has been influenced by Spanish, it's Chicano English or Mexican American English. I think the voiced bilabial fricative exists in that dialect of English. And, it just, along with that and a lot of other, little subtle variations in any dialect of English, make people sound different. And then we have perceptions about that sound and what it means. But, there's a lot of natural variation in language among different dialects. And, as we know, it's not that one dialect is any better than any others. And so, they all have different adaptations for different purposes, and sometimes they do different things. But there's a lot of variation, even just within English. Another one that I talk about all of these with students. Another one is grammar, pleaded versus pled. We kind of talk about the history of regular verbs and irregular verbs in English. Pled is kind of an older version. Well, they're both from the verb plead, but pled is kind of an older past tense version. Pleaded is probably a newer one. English, I think, over time has been shedding some of its irregular verbs a little bit, and this is one where an irregular verb, plead to pled, has become regularized from plead to pleaded. So a regular verb, is one where past tense versions end in ed, and irregular verbs are ones where the past tense, the root actually changes. So plead to pled, that's irregular, but plead to pleaded is regular. And I think over time, I share this anecdote with students sometimes, I think I remember when I would listen to the news on the radio, I used to hear pled a lot, that so-and-so pled guilty in court. But eventually I started hearing pleaded all the time, and that may have been maybe because the Associated Press sort of standardized pleaded as the choice to make with that particular verb. And I can't quite remember. That's something I should probably go look at it if I can, but I'm pretty sure I remember hearing pled a lot more, maybe 20 years ago or more. But another one that really floors students, this one's really fun. Grammar, social media is versus social media are. I take examples like this and I have them, make a guess as to which one they think is correct. And of course they always say social media is, and then I say, no, that's not correct, social media are. And they all gasp. But really it is, social media is, and I tell them that. And the reason is just that language has changed. Media is a word that we borrowed from Latin, if I remember correctly, and the plural form was media, and the singular form was medium. But when we talk about social media now, we talk about it as one thing instead of several. And so it's social media is. And then I talk about mass nouns and nouns that you can count. And social media is a mass noun like wheat or water, where, you could have a lot of it, but you still say it is. Or you could have a lot of kernels of wheat, but you still say wheat is. So I talk to them about that. And the reason why I do that, I bring these kinds of examples into my classes. And the reason why is because I just demonstrate to them, what we want to do is we just want to be dynamic, because language is naturally variant. And there are going to be things that are perceived as errors that really might not be. But the idea is not to worry about being correct. It's about that sort of exchange between writers and audiences where there may be perceived correctness. And so sometimes we'll talk about that. But it really kind of set the stage. The linguistics course, the grammar course, they both really set the stage for me when it comes to teaching writing. So here are some of my perceptions now that were really useful to me as a beginning writing instructor, still useful to me today. Error in ELL students' writing. I don't see errors in their writing. I don't see them as errors. I see them as educated guesses based on their first language, because that's the way that it works. If somebody's learning a second language, their brain is automatically going to go to their prior knowledge, and their prior knowledge about language comes from their first language. And so if there's something that we think is an error by somebody who is not a native English speaker, it isn't an error really, it's an educated guess. Language is naturally variant. Of course, that's really important. Sometimes we can perceive nuances in language and sometimes we can't. Same thing is true of audiences when we write. Sometimes they might perceive something as an error, sometimes they might not. Pronunciation and other judgments for any speaker of any language is based on previous experiences with language, and those are reasoned judgments as well. And power dynamics exist in writing and language, and so all of those kind of come from my knowledge about variation. And the linguistics course helped set that up for me. The grammar course helped set that up for me. And those ideas, I remember them at the outset when I was starting to teach writing. When I first started in 1999, I was not as concerned about errors in my student writing or just trying to fix those errors as I was, helping them find writing strategies to use. And so that conceptual knowledge about language for me has created opportunities. I can have discussions with students about, the variation in accents in, different dialects of English, or maybe the accents that ELL students bring with them as well. And so it can just open up a discussion where I can ask students, okay, what kind of strategies can we use to deal with these variances in language? And it can also open up discussions about power dynamics in language and why those exist. And so those are some really good starting points that I like to bring in, because students, I think, need to hear them. Excuse me. So just to talk about conceptual knowledge a little bit more here, because I've kind of been talking about factual knowledge and conceptual knowledge, and I even brought up theoretical knowledge once. But Richard Haskell really has this kind of broken down in his book, Transfer of Learning, Cognition, Instruction, and Reasoning. Excuse me. So he says there are kinds of knowledge in his book, and he says that declarative knowledge, what something is the most important one, because that's where all the others come from. So I've been using the word factual knowledge, and that's kind of what he means here. You just have to have a broad base of knowledge, like Daniel T. Willingham said earlier in the podcast here. Declarative knowledge is just, basic factual knowledge about what something is. Procedural knowledge is how to do something. Strategic knowledge, we're getting kind of metacognitive here, so self-evaluation and self-monitoring. Conditional knowledge, making judgments about when to use knowledge in context-appropriate ways. And those two really are, reflective of expertise. Strategic knowledge and conditional knowledge. Those are things, if you read other works in learning, those are hallmarks of expertise, that somebody can self-evaluate, that they can make judgments about, when to use particular knowledge in a particular context. And then theoretical knowledge, deep relationships between things. And so I think what I've been talking about here today, some of that gets from declarative knowledge possibly over to theoretical knowledge about the way learning works, the way that I've applied that. We're not talking about errors, we're talking about educated guesses, or we're talking about the natural variance of language and so on and so forth. When I bring those things in with my students, I would say that probably is theoretical knowledge. But that's just kind of the way that it has manifest in my understanding of grammar and linguistics. So my own use of conceptual knowledge, to get back to this idea of transfer, it's transferred from my linguistics course and my grammar course from, 30 years ago to my teaching today, and that was never brought up back then. I wasn't, taking linguistics and grammar to prepare to be a writing teacher. I was just taking them because they were requirements, and there was no connection to teaching writing that the professor drew up or anything like that. It was just something that kind of happened. But my use of that conceptual knowledge about, thinking about bilabial fricatives or thinking about language as naturally variant, that came partly about, the transfer came about because I found myself in a place where that knowledge could be cued. I was confronted with, what people sometimes perceive as student errors, even early on in my career. And there were always discussions about that, and my brain would always go back to language being naturally variant. When we think about medicine or business or other disciplines, what happens for students a lot, I think, is, they get some knowledge, and then when they take another class or when they, graduate and get into their workplace, they are going to, they're going to be cued by the knowledge that they gained earlier is going to be cued by the context where they are later. And I think the same thing has happened to me. But I also think that writing knowledge, even though most of our students are only going to take maybe 1 or 2 semesters of writing courses in first year writing, and then of course, there will be students who take advanced courses or they go into professional writing or something like that. But writing is everywhere, and you use it everywhere. And so I see that as an opportunity, even if we just have students for a year of first year writing courses, that they're definitely going to be in a spot where they could cue that knowledge, or where that knowledge could be cued for them later. And so it's just important to find ways to help that knowledge light up for them when they are in those future contexts. And so that's an opportunity, I think. Just writing is so it's just ubiquitous. It's used for everything else. And so there would be opportunities there for that learning to go with them. And there are some strategies for that we can talk about. But my use of conceptual knowledge really did, I think, depend on being in a place where it could be cued. So just in closing, my memory of knowledge, my knowledge of and transfer of knowledge about linguistics and grammar, it began with factual and conceptual knowledge. Without that, I probably wouldn't be using it today. Bodies of knowledge rely heavily on language about that knowledge. The same is true of writing. It's a body of knowledge. It's not just a skill. Writing is a body of knowledge, really important. The question shouldn't be, can they write, which I get a lot, when somebody finds out that I teach writing. Can students write? That's not the question. It should be, what do they know about writing? And that has really huge implications for teaching and also things like assessment. Conceptual knowledge in the Elon Statement is where the possibility for learning about writing begins. Without a good body of knowledge about writing, what things are, there can be no learning and no skill set that writers can take with them. And coming up, what conceptual knowledge of writing can students take with them? And I also just throwing this in there because I think it's important too. What does that have to do with our response to student use of artificial intelligence in higher education? Because I know that keeps coming up, and over the summer, I'm sure lots of people are thinking about that, and I want to think about it too. So that's on my mind for the podcast in the near future. What does conceptual knowledge of writing have to do with our response to student use of AI in higher education? So thank you so much. I really appreciate your viewing or your listening, and please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next episode. I hope you're having a great summer.